Today, we are looking at chapter 14 in your Memler's textbook. So we are taking a big jump forward because there's a whole bunch of stuff that is taught in there that we don't need. So we are moving straight forward, past the kinetic chain into chapter 14, where we're going to look at the heart, your blood, and we'll look briefly at blood vessels as well. So we're basically going to be looking at your entire cardiovascular system today. So looking at the heart, right? Big things that we got to talk about. We're going to talk about the structure of your heart and like what those layers are, and the things like the pericardium and the myocardium and the endocardium. Those are the different layers of your heart. We'll look at the different chambers and valves that are inside of your heart, and then the blood flow to your arteries. Then we're going to be looking at like function, where we look at like cardiac cycle and your blood pressure and things like that. We'll talk a little bit about some of the diseases of the heart, although we'll move through that pretty quickly. And then we'll talk very briefly about how to study the heart, because most of these are in ways that we don't really apply. Disease treatments, aging, things like a lot of this stuff we'll be moving through pretty quick. But looking at your heart, when we talk about like, when we talk about your cardiovascular system, it's not just your heart by itself, right? Like obviously your cardiovascular, the heart is the pump that sort of powers everything. But you've got blood vessels, which allow all of the blood to travel. You have got the blood itself, which is the medium that like delivers everything, and it's got some unique properties that allow it to do that. So, that's really what we're looking at when we look at the cardiovascular system. But if we're just talking about the heart itself, right? Your circulatory system, which is sometimes what the cardiovascular system, circulatory system is this continuous one-way circuit of blood vessels through which blood is pumped by the heart. So you can see like all three of these things kind of working in conjunction together, right? So the heart itself is this muscular blood pumping organ that is responsible for the real job of the heart is to create and maintain pressure. And that's the really big deal here that we look at, right? Maintaining that pressure is really what allows the heart to actually move blood around, because it's creating areas of high pressure and it's creating areas of low pressure. And that pressure gradient is what makes, blood flow from one spot to another. So if there's a lot of pressure over here and very little pressure over here, blood's going to want to travel that way naturally, right? So it's located in between the lungs in what is called the mediastinum. That's basically this little chest cavity right in here. It is not over the left side, as a lot of people have said. I know we all hold our hand over the left side of our heart during like the national anthem and stuff, but your heart is pretty much dead center in your chest. However, it does ever so slightly point to the left, which we call the apex. And that's just because the left chamber of the heart, the left bottom chamber of the heart, is a little bit heavier and a little bit more muscular and thick. And so that allows it to kind of tip a little bit. So you can see that right here. You can see it's like I said, it's pretty much dead center, but it does kind of point over to the left-hand side. And it's located right here in between the lungs. And you can see here are these big blood vessels that allow, blood to travel in. And there's some other blood vessels you're not really seeing here, but that allow, blood to travel out, blood to travel in, all the different areas there. So that's your overall heart, right? Your heart is the pump here, and it's composed of several chambers. Those chambers are what are creating that high pressure and low pressure, right? So the muscular layers of the heart contract, and then they've got these chambers in them. And so like when it squeezes one of the chambers, that's very high pressure, so blood's going to want to flow out of that chamber. Meanwhile, another chamber is relaxing, and so blood wants to naturally travel into there. And then it's going to pump all that blood, out of those chambers. It sort of like switches, and that's where you get that like lub-dub sensation in your heart, right? So that's the heart there. When you look at the circulatory system, we talk about the blood vessels, right? This is a continuous one-way circuit of blood vessels through which blood is pumped by the heart, right? So when we look at the circulatory side of things, right, this is where you've got all the blood vessels that are attached to the heart. I mean, your heart can't just like splash blood down to your legs, right? We need to be able to have like blood vessels that allow that blood to travel. For the record, there are animals that do let blood just kind of splash around everywhere it goes. That's called an open vascular system. We have what's called a closed vascular system because it's a closed circuit of tubes, right? Which is why we don't want to, open up any of those tubes because that's going to allow blood to leak out. And that's what you see when you're bruised. Basically hit yourself really, really hard, and then like that causes like a bruise to form. That bruising that you're seeing is blood leaking out of blood vessels. And so it's leaking out into the area, and you're seeing it under your skin. Because we basically, tore open some of those tubes in our closed vascular system. But there are animals that have open vascular systems, like spiders, for instance. They have an open vascular system, which is what allows them to be able to like kind of swing and fly through the air pretty quickly, at least, quick compared to like the size of their body, without causing their blood pressure to completely drop. Which is why, and I hate to do this because this ruins Spider-Man movies forever, there never really could be like an effective Spider-Man. If someone was to swing that fast, all the blood would pool in their legs because of our closed vascular system. And then, their brain would basically pass out. But spiders can actually do it. So that's what we're looking at with the circular system, right? It provides a means by which blood can travel. And then we've got the blood. The blood is the medium that actually like delivers oxygen and other nutrients, right? It's comprised of a lot of different pieces here. When we look at like blood, it's not just red blood cells. There's actually going to be a lot of just like water in there as well. But then there's going to be white blood cells. So you can actually see here, if you look at how like, this down here, these are your erythrocytes. These are your red blood cells, right? So a good chunk of your blood is definitely like the red blood cells. And this is, this specialized little cell that contains little molecules of iron, and that iron binds to oxygen, and that oxygen gets delivered to our cells. So we're really grateful for the very cool shape that our red blood cells have. But you've also got plasma in here, right? And plasma is going to be, basically like fluid and some other materials. And then, things like platelets and stuff. You're going to see some proteins that are flowing around in your blood. You're going to see some sugar and stuff like that, the sodium and fat, the materials that are the products of digestion. And then you're going to see like a lot of like leukocytes in here as well. These are your red blood cells. These are your white blood cells. And so like, your platelets and your white blood cells, this is, your immune system basically lives right here. So if you were to put blood into like a centrifuge, that little machine that spins it like crazy, it would basically separate into all these little different components here, and you'd be able to see it. So that is sort of what we see in those are sort of the components of our blood. And so, the whole point of our cardiovascular system is to be able to transport that blood around the body. We need to be able to get oxygen, to the different cells throughout our body. And so we use the blood vessels to be able to allow that oxygen to travel. We allow the blood to carry that oxygen, and we use the heart to pump it. So that's your cardiovascular system in a nutshell. Now, if we're looking at it, right, and like I said, the cardiovascular system is the big overall system, and it's your heart, it's your blood vessels, and it's responsible for delivering nutrients throughout the body, right? So there's our big summary here. This sentence, by the way, is directly out of your NASM textbook. I threw this in here just because like we needed like a section header, but this is actually the definition you're going to find in your NASM text. So this is a big definition right here. So let's look at the heart, right? The heart, like I said, the pump that kind of powers everything, right? So your heart is going to be comprised of several different layers, kind of similarly to how your muscle was, which makes sense because your heart is very muscular, and it's got to be able to be strong enough to actually pump all this stuff around. And so you've got different layers within your heart, right? If we're looking at these layers here, and this is kind of just true, if you were to like, create the layers of something, if you were to create like a wall of some type, right? You would fill it up kind of like this. You would have different layers. You'd have an inner layer that can kind of handle the stresses of inner stress or whatever is happening on the inside. And then you'd create like an outer layer so that it would have like, deal with the stresses of stuff outside. And then maybe have like a meaty inner layer. This is kind of like the walls of your house, You've got like the drywall on the inside of your house, which is pretty like soft, and it's meant to just serve as something that's easy to paint and hang pictures on and stuff. And then you have the outer layer, which is like your house's like paneling or siding, right? Which is like really resistant to weather damage and like the more intense stuff. And then you've got like insulation, on the inner like inside the walls there, creating like kind of holding your house's temperature and stuff. So, different layers of different materials in different sections here. Your heart's arranged like that as well. So the innermost layer is going to be your endocardium. Endo from the word meaning inner, right? And so this is the smooth innermost layer of the heart. So this right here is your endocardium, this layer on the inside here. And it's very, 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 very smooth because this is where you're going to have like the chambers inside of your heart running blood past it. So, blood's very, very good. Red blood cells are very, very good at like, attaching together along with platelets and stuff and creating like plugs. They're really good at what we call clotting. And so we don't want that happens when blood sits around in one spot too long. It starts to experience this clotting sensation, which is why we don't want to have like a rough texture on the inside of our heart. So we want to make sure that we have this nice smooth texture on the endocardium here. Then you've got the myocardium. And the myocardium is probably the most important part of the heart that we're going to talk about, right? This is the very thick middle layer. So this thick stuff right in here, that kind of looks like muscle, that is the myocardium. Myo from the word meaning muscle, and cardium coming from the word, meaning heart, right? So it's the muscular layer of the heart. This is where the really heavy lifting of, contractions inside the heart really does take place. So, we call this the cardiac muscle, right? This is the contracting, like very muscular part. And it's got these little striations on it that are, kind of similar to, when we look at like cardiac muscle, versus skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle has striations as well. Remember, we got those bundles of fascicles, so it has these big, long striations. But when you look at like the differences here, you can see, skeletal muscle is like really big striations because it's got to create really, really, really strong contractions. Smooth muscle, you don't see any striations. And then cardiac muscle, you actually see very, very little tiny striations, right? Let's zoom in here a little bit, actually, so we can see this a little more clearly. So there are these big striations, right? Lots of actin and myosin overlap, really not very much here. But then like, much thinner striations, but then do you see like these big like lines in between, right? These are much more tightly packed than your skeletal muscle fibers. That's one of the things that's like kind of unique about them. Actually, here we go. This is a really good picture right here, right? So there's smooth muscle, there's cardiac muscle, and then there's the really thick skeletal muscle, right? So your heart does need to be able to create contractions. That's what you're going to see in the myocardium. So it's lightly striated, but one of the things that's kind of unique about it is it has like less nuclei. It's got single nuclei that cover like entire large portions of these cells here. So you remember the nucleus is like, it's the brain of your cells, right? Like it's how your cell is sort of triggering like what gets done in that cell. It's in the same way that your nervous system determines everything that you do, the nucleus determines everything that your cells do. And so there's actually going to be less nuclei, which is the plural for nucleus, inside of cardiac muscle. And the reason for that, the reason there's less of those, is because we don't want too many cooks in the kitchen. Your heart cells, when they contract, we want to make sure that all of them are contracting at the exact same time. We really don't want to have your heart contract in like out of sync with itself, right? We want it to all be very, very, very much tightly packed together. And when it creates a contraction, it creates as strong a contraction as possible. That is what allows us to generate so much pressure per beat. So it's really, really important to make sure that we are doing that when we've got like our cardiac muscle, right? We got to make sure that it's all contracting simultaneously. And so that's what we look at when we see these little single nuclei. that's going to make it a lot easier for all of them to contract together. So that's kind of what's unique about the myocardium. But again, just think of the word like myo. You always, whenever you hear that, we are almost always talking about muscles, and cardium for heart, right? And then you're going to have the epicardium. And the epicardium is this layer right here that you can kind of see. Like, I guess they're making it, they're coloring it blue on the inside here, but like this is the epicardium right here. It's this outermost layer, and it's just creating like a little wall to be the plasma membrane on the outside of like your heart cells. And that's the epicardium there. But then we've got this kind of special one here, this sort of unique thing that's in the heart, which is called your pericardium. And pericardium, peri means it's around the perimeter, right? So this is the pericardium, and it's this fibrous sac that basically holds your heart in place. So when you think about it, it's kind of funny. Your heart, we really want to make sure that it kind of is stuck in our chest. We don't want our heart to, fall off one day. So we look at the pericardium. You can actually see it's this sac that basically holds your heart in place. You can see it's like going to attach itself to these different like layers here and hold it there. I love this picture. This is really, I've never seen this picture before. There's the muscular myocardium, and there's your epicardium, and then there'd be the pericardium, which is this sac that's attached to all these materials holding the heart in the center, right? So it's not actually 100%, it's not really part of the heart, really, if you think about it. It's just the sac that kind of holds your heart, your grocery bags are not part of your groceries, but a very, very important one. And the pericardium is kind of cool. It's very viscous. It has like a lot of like mucus and this very like slick material that allows your heart to contract without your pericardium ever getting stuck to the heart, which would maybe prevent it from being able to contract and expand. And also, it's not going to really get stuck to any other materials inside of your chest cavity either. It can get kind of sticky. It's supposed to be very, very slick, but you can get what is called pericarditis, which is like a disease where basically you get an infection in your heart that causes like fluid to interrupt how that pericardium is being nice and slick. And so then it can start sticking, and that can mess up the rhythm of your heart, and it can be very, very dangerous. This is one of the things that's kind of dangerous about COVID, actually. Like, they're talking about how they've seen like some long-term damage to the heart associated with really severe cases. And it's like, this is mostly like a disease of the lungs, but there's so much infection there that it has actually been shown to kind of mess up the heart as well. So looking at the special features of your myocardium, right? We already kind of talked a little bit about this, but your myocardium, that muscular layer, it's comprised, we call that your cardiac muscle. It's lightly striated. It's got striations so that it can create contractions, but it's definitely not as striated as like skeletal muscle, which has got to be able to, deadlift and stuff. It has the little single nuclei so that it makes sure that like there's not too much going on. There's not too many people, ordering the different cells of the heart around. And what's really cool about this, the most awesome part of the heart, is that it's controlled involuntarily. This is a very autonomic function. When you look at like, whether we have somatic function, which is our brain choosing to do stuff, versus autonomic function, which is the stuff that's like, automatic that we don't really have any control over. Your heart elevating, you don't have any control over that, right? Like if I made you start walking and then all of a sudden you had to start walking uphill takes more energy. So your cells start producing, more energy in order to like propel you up that hill, which is going to require more oxygen. So all of a sudden your blood becomes more acidic. And then your heart goes, oh, that's some acidic blood. We should beat faster. And then the heart's pace is actually going to increase. But who knows? You might even be able to trick your brain into being like, man, that's a steep hill. And then all of a sudden your heart rate will actually go up without you really even having to do any work. And that happens sometimes as well. So this is a very autonomic process that we don't really have any control over. Um, so looking at it, you will see that there are these what are called intercalated discs that also run through your heart, and they actually make it a lot easier for electricity to travel. And that's one of the most important things about our heart that we're going to look at a little bit later here. Your heart is constantly generating action potentials, the same way that your nervous system is, right? Like your nervous system generates action potentials so that it can zap these cells. And your muscular system is also generating action potentials in order to create muscular contractions, right? Remember, an action potential is just sodium and potassium being flushed to create a little bit of electricity, which runs across our cells and triggers our cells to do stuff, right? In your muscle cells, that triggers actin and myosin. Well, the same thing happens in your heart. But your heart, we want all of those cells to contract simultaneously. We don't want to have like an odd rhythm here. So when you look at like the cells of your heart, you'll actually notice that it has these little discs that run throughout the chamber, throughout the cells of your heart, and it makes it easier for electricity to travel around and zap everything simultaneously. It's a much stronger network. So we'll go ahead and look at that here in just a little bit. But looking at the chambers of the heart, right? Let's talk about sort of the shape of our heart here. So if we look at like heart chambers. All right, so here's the different like which one do I want? Let's go with a simple one at first. So here's the different chambers of our heart, right? And you'll notice this is from the anatomic position. So this is the left side, even though it's on the right side of the picture. Right side is on the left side. This is this person facing us. So when you look at like your heart, right, you've got these four main chambers here, okay? And they're called your atriums and your ventricles. So atrium, if I actually Google the word atrium, it'll actually pull up a picture of like a little gathering area, like it's like you'd walk into, I guess this is a bar, or a restaurant, you'd walk in and, be gathered here before moving on to somewhere else. Actually, you know what? I just realized this is a restaurant called Atrium. I was like, this is not that great of an example. But here's a great example of an atrium, right? This would be like the gathering site inside like a big building. You can see here, right? This is where people would like hang out in order to, be shuttled to wherever it is they are going in this big high-rise skyscraper thingy, right? So that's what an atrium is. It's a gathering site, right? It's where you would gather, before being like shuttled to wherever it is you're going. So your atriums here, you've got a right atrium and a left atrium. They're going to gather blood that returns back to the heart. And that's what an atrium's job is, right? Atriums gather blood that is returning to the heart. Then you've also got your ventricles, and ventricles are going to pump blood out of the heart. And so this is where like, we're going to pump it, if it's the right ventricle, it's going to pump it over to the lungs. If it's the left ventricle, it's going to pump it everywhere in our body, right? It's going to get it all the way up to our brain against gravity, and it's going to get it all the way down to our feet, very far away from the heart, right? So these are the different chambers inside of your heart that are doing all of this, pumping action that we're talking about. So your heart is a double pump. There's two sides of that pump. Half of it goes to the lungs, the other half of it goes throughout the rest of the body, right? So we got to look at the heart in a couple different ways here. We got to kind of divide it down, which is great because we can see two different colors here, right? We got to divide it into the right side of our heart and the left side. And the right side of your heart is in charge of getting blood to the lungs so that we can oxygenate that blood, right? We need to make sure that we get new oxygen into those blood cells. And the left side of the heart, its job is to deliver that oxygenated blood throughout the body. So when we look at it, right, the right side of the heart pumps low oxygen blood into the lungs. We call that your pulmonary circuit because your lungs is your pulmonary system. So the right side of the heart is going to pump low oxygen blood into the lungs through the pulmonary circuit. The left side of the heart is going to pump blood to the rest of the body via what we call the systemic circuit. We call it the systemic circuit because it's all of the other systems in the body, right? We got to keep the brain, the nervous system running. We got to keep the urinary system running, like whatever, right? We got to get all of it, like getting plenty of oxygen delivered, right? So Again, the right side is your pulmonary circuit. The left side is your systemic circuit. So the right side pumps blood to the lungs and the left side pumps blood, throughout the rest of the body. So those are our two systems here. So now we've got like our pulmonary circuit here and we got our systemic circuit here. Now in both of these circuits, you are going to have an atrium at the top and a ventricle at the bottom. So if we just look at the pulmonary circuit first, right? This is the right side of your heart. It's going to have your right atrium, which is the chamber of the heart that's receiving blood from the body, right? So this is your low oxygenated blood. So we think about like, again, this is where blood is coming back. And this right side here is trying to get blood to the lungs. So that means if it's blood that's coming back because it needs to go to the lungs, it means that it's blood that has already dropped off all of its oxygen and it's ready to pick up new oxygen, right? So blood's going to pool in here. You can actually see this little blood vessel right here and this one right here. This is your superior and inferior vena cava, which are basically these little chambers that are dropping blood in there. You can see a little bit, you can see the arrows here. There's that superior, there's that inferior. And so it's dumping blood into this right atrium right here. And then, once there's enough blood gathered in here, what's going to happen is this little valve is going to open up and that blood's going to drop into the right ventricle here. And if we look at it in our notes, right, the right ventricle is the chamber of the heart responsible for ejecting blood out of the heart towards the lungs, right? So again, atrium means to gather, ventricle means to push, right? To push blood out of the heart. So we gather the blood in the right side, drop it into the ventricle, and then when the heart contracts, you see, look at all this muscle around here, right? There's a very muscular section here. This is going to contract and it's going to eject that blood out. And actually, it's not going to eject it through here. It's going to eject it, where did that picture go? It's going to eject it right up through here. And this valve actually splits into two different directions. So that's going to go, either into the left side of the heart or it's going to pump over into the right side of the heart. Lungs. It's going to go into either your left lung. It's either going to go into your left lung or your right lung. So that is the ventricle there, right? So again, blood returns, drops, and is ejected out. So then, now that blood gets all the way over to the lungs, that blood's gonna, drop off any CO2 that it has, and it's gonna pick up a whole bunch of oxygen, right? It's gonna pick up as much oxygen as it can into those red blood cells. So now you've got highly, we call it oxygenated blood. Just means bright red blood cells, right? So now we start drawing it in this kind of reddish color. And by the way, like, I'm sure you guys have seen plenty of pictures, and maybe even someone has said like, your blood is actually blue in the beginning and then, it hits oxygen and that's what turns it red. That is totally not true. You never have blue blood in your body. There's never a moment where your blood is blue. Your blood is either really dark red or it's bright red. And so when we look at like oxygenated, let's see here if I can find a good picture of this. Yeah, that works. It looks like this. I know it's not distinctly different looking, but it's never blue. It's just this really dark red color versus like a really bright red color. And I'm sure all they did was they just took a bunch of blood and filled these vials and they just, and probably just shot some CO2 in here and pulled all the oxygen out. And they probably shot some oxygen and that just, made it good for this picture. So that's actually what your blood looks like, right? So, we've got all this deoxygenated blood. I mean, like this is blood that's returning, from the body. That means that, maybe my blood just got back from my right quad as I'm running up a hill. So my quad burned up all the oxygen that was in my blood cells and, spit out all the CO2 onto those same blood cells. So now those blood cells have no more oxygen. It's this dark red color. Drops into the right atrium, goes into the right ventricle, gets pumped to the lungs. Once it's in the lungs, it's going to drop all that CO2 off, which I'm then going to exhale. And I'm going to take a big inhale, and all this new oxygen is going to come in, and it's going to saturate that red blood cell, and it's going to turn bright red because now it's got lots of oxygen in it. And now that blood cell is going to get sucked back into my heart and gathered again. So because it's getting gathered, it's going to land here in this left atrium, right? And so it'll gather in the left atrium, and that's what we see here, right? Your systemic circuit, which is responsible for pumping blood throughout the rest of the body, the left side of your heart, right? It's going to gather in your left atrium, which is the chamber that receives blood that is returning from the lungs. This is highly oxygenated blood. And then it's going to drop from the left atrium into the left ventricle. The left ventricle is the chamber of the heart responsible for ejecting blood out towards the entire body. So this left ventricle is the one that we honestly pay the most attention to, especially as personal trainers, right? Like this left ventricle is the part of the heart that's squeezing blood to deliver it, to our glute muscles while we're doing squats, to our brain while we're thinking about stuff. It's ejecting blood out throughout your entire body. And you can see it's the much more muscular side of the heart. Because you think about like the right chamber, it's only got to pump blood a couple inches, right? Like my lungs are right next to my heart. But this left chamber, it's got to get blood all the way down to our feet, which is not exactly close. And it has to go against gravity up to the brain, right? Which is not exactly easy to do. So this chamber is much, 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 much more muscular. And it's going to be able to generate a lot more pressure. This is also whenever you're feeling your pulse, right? And you feel that like contraction, that is what you are feeling. You are feeling the left ventricle squeezing. And when you feel that like squeezing sensation in the left ventricle there, you can feel that on your blood vessels as they are sort of pushed apart every time. So those are the different chambers here, right? So let's imagine like a new red blood cell that's never actually done anything before. I want to imagine a red blood cell, maybe it just got, put into the world from your femur, because your bones are what make your blood cells, right? And so this new red blood cell has never delivered oxygen, never carried oxygen before. And so it's going to travel to the heart, right? It's going to get swept up in the flow, and it's going to travel, it's returning from the body. So because it's returning from the body, it's going to go into this right atrium. And then it gets gathered up with a whole bunch of other red blood cells, and then it gets dropped into the right ventricle. The heart contracts, and that pushes that blood cell out of the right ventricle over to the lungs, where it is going to pick up its very first bit of oxygen that it's ever had, right? And then your heart is going to relax, which will draw blood back into the left atrium. So now that blood cell is going to travel here into the left atrium and get gathered up with a bunch of other highly oxygenated blood cells. And then that will get dropped into the left ventricle, where the heart will squeeze really hard, and that will pump that blood cell and all the other ones out of the heart throughout the rest of the body. So maybe that blood cell travels up to the brain, delivers oxygen for the first time, picks up a bunch of CO2 for the first time, and then travels right back to that right atrium, to right ventricle, to lungs, to left atrium, to left ventricle. And then this time maybe it gets pumped down to, your hamstring muscle, back to the right atrium, back to the right ventricle, back to the lungs, left atrium, left ventricle. And it's going to repeat, and it's going to do that, constantly for the entire life of that red blood cell. And that is sort of how the chambers of our heart really work. And you can see that here, right? We can see here the little chambers that allow blood to pool in the right atrium. It'll drop into the right ventricle, where it'll get squeezed over to the lungs. It'll come back into the left atrium, to the left ventricle, and then that'll squeeze super hard. And by the way, look at this like blood vessel right here. This is called your aorta. Look at how friggin' thick this thing is, right? This is a really thick, very muscular tube attached to your heart, because this is where pressure is highest in your body. Blood just got shot out of the heart like crazy hard. We want to make sure that we get this nice, really strong aorta there to kind of deal with all that pressure. And then your blood vessels will kind of get thinner and thinner as it goes through areas of lower pressure. So those are the chambers of the heart, right? You've got your pulmonary circuit, which is the right side of the heart, and you've got your systemic circuit, which is the left side of the heart. If you want my biggest pro tip for how to memorize these chambers, memorize the definitions in general of what like a ventricle is versus an atrium, right? You got to remember that like atriums gather stuff, ventricles pump stuff, right? And then all you got to do is just pay attention to this left ventricle right here. The left ventricle is the chamber that's responsible for pumping blood to the entire body. And it's on the left, right? So you can logically figure it out by being like, all right, well, if the left ventricle pumps blood to the body, the right ventricle does the opposite of that. It pumps blood to the lungs, right? So now you know exactly what both ventricles do. And then you know that like the left side and the left side is attached to, the left atrium and the left ventricle work together, and the right atrium and the right ventricle work together. You know that ventricles pump stuff. You remember that atriums gather stuff. So you can figure it out that way. You could say, okay, well, if the left ventricle pumps blood to the body, then the left atrium is getting blood that's got to get pumped to the rest of the body. If the right atrium is gathering deoxygenated blood, right, it's going to go to the right ventricle to get pumped to the lungs. So you can kind of just, I would pay attention to this one right here. If you memorize this left ventricle, it will help you figure out the rest of the heart just by doing a simple little bit of, logical thinking. Any questions on that, guys? I know the chambers of the heart gets a little technical. Any questions there? All four of you guys feeling good? Okay. So let's go ahead and look at our valves here. Let's take a look at the structure of the heart. It's valves, which is really what's creating all the pressure. Like your heart creates the contractions, but that would really just cause blood to splash around for the most part. Squeezing, like imagine if you put your hand in a pool of water and you started squeezing, it's not really going to do much, right? Unless you were to like seal in that water somehow. And you could do that if you were to create like valves. And so really one of the coolest parts of your heart are all these little valves here. You can see this valve right here and that valve there and there and there, right? Those little valves are what actually generate the pressure, because your valve will be closed down when blood needs to, travel. So your heart starts squeezing, but the valve is closed. So what that does is that creates an enormous amount of pressure, the same way that if you squeeze a balloon, right, you're creating a lot of pressure. And so then all of a sudden the valve opens up and boom, that blood gets ejected from the heart in order to like travel wherever it needs to go. So we've got a couple different types of valves. You've got tricuspid and bicuspid valves, semilunar valves. They're all shaped a little bit differently. You don't necessarily need to have a deep understanding of like how these valves are shaped or anything, but just remember that every chamber on the heart has a series of valves that are creating all of that pressure. And so, when you are working on like, your blood pressure, one of the reasons that's so important is because like if you are creating too much pressure, you might damage those valves. And if you damage those valves, then you're going to further have even more pressure problems. So what could start happening is like maybe one of those valves stops closing all the way, or maybe its timing gets off and it can't close when it's supposed to. And so then the chambers of the heart start leaking. And when that happens, you'll actually hear that. Let's see here. And so you'll hear stuff like this. It's called a murmur.
I'm a TurboTax Live expert, ready to assess even the most unique situations.
Ugh. Hush, ads.
The second heart sound, dub, or S2, originates from the closing of the aortic and pulmonary valves right after the ventricles have ejected the blood. The time interval between S1 and S2 is when the ventricles contract, called systole.
There we go. That's what I was looking for. So that's a normal heart sound, right? That's a pretty normal, like lub dub, lub dub. The first heart sound, low. Right? And you're hearing the valves slamming shut, basically. But if we look at like an altered heart rhythm, right? Let's take a look at like what a heart murmur sounds like. If those valves can't close down effectively, it starts to sound a little bit more like this.
Based on the time they occur in the cardiac cycle, their changes in intensity over time, and the auscultation site, murmurs or whooshing sounds produced by turbulent flow of blood. Murmurs are diagnosed based on the time they occur in the cardiac cycle, their changes in intensity over time, peak of ventricular contraction, small rises.
Man, this video is very hard to navigate. Just play the freaking sound. I see you with an animation here.
Results in a crescendo decrescendo, or a diamond-shaped murmur, which starts a short moment after S1. It is often preceded by an ejection click caused by the opening of the
This is why
valve.
biology classes are so. There we go. So you hear that? It's
Aortic
kind of distinct, right? You hear how it like squeals a little bit at the very end versus like just a very hard like lubbed up, right? It's not like a knocking, it's like a dragging, you know. That little difference there is all the difference of like different, you know, these valves. And so like blood could basically be backflowing rather than getting pushed forward. And that's not great, right? That's the kind of stuff that we need to kind of work on through like strengthening the heart, which is why our jobs exist, you know. Your heart, like I said, it's pumping blood throughout the entire body, delivering oxygen, right? Like it's delivering blood throughout the entire body. Well, your heart is still made up of its own cells, and it can't just passively suck oxygen out of the chambers of the heart. So the very most important part of your heart's like delivering oxygen throughout the body is going to be through what is called your coronary arteries, which are arteries that supply the myocardium with oxygen, right? So when you look at this, your heart, you know, when you're flying on a plane and they say, you know, if there's ever like a mask that drops from the ceiling, you should secure your own mask before securing the mask of like a child. Like you should take care of yourself first so you can help the kids second. And that sounds really selfish. You're like, no. Like I should prioritize, you know, like this, you know, but the reason you don't do that is because like, if you pass out first, you can't help anybody, you know? Your heart takes a very similar approach. Your heart will supply itself with blood first, then it will supply blood throughout the rest of the body. And so those are what your coronary arteries are. And you'll notice, like if we go back to the chambers of the heart, right, here's that aortic arch here, right? This is your aorta. And so blood gets pumped out of the left ventricle. It's going to go to the rest of the body. But what you don't see in this picture are these little tiny branches that actually break off of the aorta and they cover the entire heart. And so there's some blood that loops right back around to the outside of the heart in order to deliver oxygen to the cells of the heart itself. So the heart is keeping itself alive as well here. And these are the most important arteries inside of your whole body, because again, these are the arteries that keep the pump that keeps the rest of the body alive. Right? So we want to make sure that this pump is getting enough blood flow. This is the most important thing, you know, then your brain as well. But like both these are really, really key here, right? So it's on this short little loop. And then there's also cardiac veins that are going to gather all the deoxygenated blood. So when we talk about coronary heart disease, which is the #1 killer of human beings in the US, right? The thing that kills us more than anything else is coronary heart disease. And that is the buildup of plaque, which is basically just like cholesterol and fats building up on the inside of our walls here, on the inside of the coronary arteries, which diminishes the amount of blood that can flow through the vessels, leading to decreased oxygen delivery to the cells of the heart. So the #1 thing that kills us is coronary heart disease. And it's, you know, so many of our clients, you know, and basically what we see, I guess these are all fun. What we see are these coronary arteries that, you know, this is the pump that supplies blood everywhere. And we're basically making sure that the pump doesn't get enough oxygen, which means it can't do its job. And it builds up with plaque, you know, until eventually it's closing down blood flow and blood's just not traveling. You know, then we have a heart attack. So that is coronary heart disease in a nutshell, right? And then here you can see like what these valves kind of look like and how they work and how they're shaped and stuff. We don't need to pay too much attention to that. Any questions there, guys? Any questions on coronary heart disease or what the chambers of the heart are, or, you know, anything like that? Erica?
No, everything's good.
Oh, you got me. I was like, Cool. Kenny, feeling good?
All clear, all good.
Okay, so let's take a look at our cardiac cycle. So we are talking about different heartbeats and stuff, right? Like your heart is, squeezing and relaxing and squeezing and relaxing, right? And it does it at different rates. Sometimes it goes really fast, sometimes it goes relatively slow, right? So we got to look at like what's happening during our regular cardiac cycle. So cardiac cycle is basically just our definition for, the rhythm of the heart, right? If I go like, the cycle is squeezing, relaxing, right? There we are. We're at the whole loop, right? It's very complicated, I know. So the two parts of cardiac cycle are going to be the active phase and the resting phase. So the active phase is what we refer to as like systole. This is the contraction of the heart, right? And so systole is when your heart is squeezing. Now, when that happens, pressure is really high. Just like if I had a water bottle here and I squeezed it, right, the pressure inside the bottle would be really high. So if I squeezed it and I held it there and I took the lid off, all the water would come shooting out, right? Because water is going to want to travel from this area of high pressure inside the bottle to an area of low pressure outside the bottle. That's how super soakers work, like, you got the little like chamber there and you pump the thing up and then you shoot a bunch of water out of there because you created a lot of pressure. So systole is the active contraction, right? That creates a lot of pressure. And then diastole is the passive relaxation of the heart, where that draws blood back into the chambers of the heart. So systole is this, diastole is this. And so that's the what we're seeing in like a normal heart rhythm, right? So you can see here, right? Blood's, again, it's going to travel into this right atrium to get gathered, travel into the right ventricle. Meanwhile, exactly at the same time, blood is returning from the lungs into the the left atrium and dropping into the left ventricle, right? So when that happens, both of these chambers here, both of these ventricles are filled with blood simultaneously. I know we kind of taught it in like 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And that is like the route that a single blood cell is going through. But you got to remember, like from the last contraction, all your old blood cells are doing their bit, right? So really what's happening is blood's coming into the top of the heart, dropping down and getting pumped to two different areas. Then it's coming back, down, pumped, right? And that's kind of how that's working, right? It's sort of a double figure eight that's happening like simultaneously. So what will happen is the top of your heart will relax, and that draws blood into both atriums. And then it drops that blood into the ventricles. And then when your heart squeezes, both ventricles simultaneously eject blood out of the heart. And that is, like I said, that's systole, right? So systole is when the ventricles contract, blood travels either to the lungs or blood travels out to the body, right? And then diastole is when the heart relaxes, drawing blood back into those chambers there. So that is a normal cardiac cycle there. Now, when we're talking about blood pressure, by the way, we are talking about systole over diastole. Normal pressure inside of your heart, and I think I'm going to see this later. Yep. Normal blood pressure inside of the heart is going to be when your systole is about 120 units of pressure and your diastole is about 80 units of pressure. So 120 over 80 is what you'll hear people say when we talk about normal blood pressure. Now, looking at the function of the heart, right? If we're getting a little bit more into, if we're getting a little bit more into how your heart actually functions in terms of measuring its ability to deliver oxygen, right? This is what we're going to refer to as your cardiac output. So your cardiac output is the overall function of your heart, okay? And that definition right there, guys, get that memorized. Get that definition for sure memorized. This is a big one. And it's the measurement of the amount of blood that is pumped out of your heart per minute, okay? A heart that can pump more blood per minute is a more efficient heart. That's a heart that's in really, really, really good shape. So there are two components to cardiac output. There's two sides of it, right? In the same way that like, let's imagine like an athlete, right? Let's imagine an athlete who's got like really, long legs, right? But they're also like really good at churning their legs over. They're also really, really strong. So, they're able to cover a lot of distance per step, and they're able to take a lot of steps per minute. So their step rate is really high and their step length is really high. Both of those things come together to create speed. And so the more ground you can travel per step, and the faster you can take those steps, the faster you're going to be, right? Now, what if that really long athlete tried to like really extend their stride length, right? They try to take even larger steps. Could be good because they're traveling, they're covering more ground every single time they take a step. But the problem with that is they can't take very many steps very, very often. So they're actually going to lose speed. And the same thing is true on the other side. If they take a lot of steps really, really quickly, by shortening their stride, yeah, maybe they can take more steps per second or per minute, but they're not going to be covering very much ground. So that's going to also result in lower speed, right? Well, that's kind of what we look at in your cardiac output as well. When you see a client who has like a high heart rate, even though they're not doing very much work, you know what that shows us? That shows us that they have a weak heart. Because yeah, they're able to beat their heart really, really fast, but they're not pumping very much blood every single time because the contractions are really weak. So that shows us that they have low cardiac output, right? The amount of blood that they're pumping per minute is low, even though their heart may be beating very fast. This is one of the reasons why we as personal trainers pay so much attention to someone's resting heart rate. The lower your resting heart rate is, the more in shape I know your heart is performing, right? That wasn't a very good sentence, but like the lower your resting heart rate is, the more in shape you are, because I know that you're pumping a lot of blood per beat because your heart is creating these really strong contractions. So labeling these out, giving these names here, the stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped out of your heart with every single beat. Okay, that's your stroke volume. It's how much blood. So if I've got let's say I've got a water bottle, right? And then let's say, and I've got my little baby forearms here. You guys can see them. I've got really thin wrists. Grip strength is not one of my strongest abilities in the world of weightlifting. But let's take a look here at like Brian Shaw. Okay, Brian Shaw, very, very famous power lifter, strong man. Crazy stupid strong guy. He's part of that whole Eddie Hall crew and stuff. Let's see here. He has got a very, very impressive grip strength. His ability to like grip, part of it is he also has gigantic hands. He's a huge person, but his ability to like grip stuff, I mean, he just has a really, really strong forearm, right? And you'll see him like pick this is actually a really fun video. I think I've watched this before where he does these, tries to
I seen him in the Netflix movie.
Oh yeah, yep. Brian Shaw, he's the man. He's such a goofball too. I love him. He's like I love Eddie Hall's my favorite because he's just such a like, weirdo. I think Eddie Hall's the funniest, but man, Brian Shaw is such a cool guy. So anyway, incredibly grip. So imagine he and I both are given a water bottle, the same size, right? And, we're going to take the lid off that water bottle and we're both going to squeeze it as hard as we can. Maybe the water I'm going to shoot, but his is going to go flying out of there. He's going to eject that water 20 feet into the air. I'm going to try to just get it out of the bottle, right? That is, based on like how strong of a contraction we were able to create. So that is what stroke volume is inside of your heart. When your heart's really strong, it squeezes really hard and blood gets shot out of the heart like crazy. Now, if your heart's really weak, it's going to squeeze and then, very little blood's going to travel out. So that is your stroke volume. It's the amount of blood pumped out of your heart every time your heart beats. And then the other component of cardiac output is your heart rate. How often is that happening, right? So now let's go back to me versus Brian Shaw. Saying that is embarrassing. Let's go back to me versus Brian Shaw, right? And let's say that there are a series of 10-pound plates, right? Let's say we both got a stack of 100 10-pound plates. So there's 1,000 pounds in his pile, and there's 1,000 pounds in my pile, right? And they're little 10-pound plates, like that's not too bad. Those are pretty light, right? And so we've got to get that 1,000 pounds all the way from here over down the hall over there, right? So if I can probably pick up, I'm going to stack them into my arms. I'm going to try and carry as many of those 10-pound plates every time, as many as I can. But the thing is, like, I'm kind of a cardio athlete, like I'm much more, about like running small little bits of something at a time. I'm much more like a runner than I am like a heavy lifter, right? So, I'm probably not going to put as many plates into my arm, and I'm going to try and sprint over to the other side, drop all those plates off and sprint back, and pile some more in there and sprint back. Meanwhile, Brian Shaw over here, he's stacking, 20 or 30 of these things, like into his arm at a time. And he's maybe moving a little bit slower than I am, right? But he's getting the job done. It took me 30 or 40 trips, took Brian Shaw maybe 10 or 15 trips. But we both moved the same amount of weight. Go back to your heart, right? Imagine like your heart isn't able to, you've got to pump the same volume of blood. Let's say, you've got a stronger heart than this person next to you. You both have to go up the same hill, which means you have to pump the same amount of blood to get up that hill, right? But your heart is stronger. So it took you 40 beats to get up that hill. And the other person, it might have taken them 60, 70, 80 beats, right? That shows us that they have a weaker heart. This is a really important concept to understand, because this is something that, we can't necessarily measure in the gym directly. I can't hook someone up to a machine while they're at the gym to measure how much blood is being ejected from their heart. I just don't have the equipment to do that, right? But I do want to know how their heart is performing. So what I can pay attention to is their heart rate. I can say, okay, we're going to put you under this much stress. I'm going to put you on a treadmill, and I'm going to make you go at 6 miles per hour, and you're going to go for 1 mile, and I'm going to measure what your heart rate is at the end. And we're going to do it again in 4 weeks. And if their heart rate at, it was the same speed, the same distance, right? Took the same amount of time. And if their heart rate is lower in 4 weeks, that shows me that their heart is getting stronger. Does that make sense, everybody?
Sure.
Mm-hmm. So that's your cardiac output. It's the overall form. And then you get your stroke volume, which is the amount of blood, the heart rate, which is the number of beats. There is a formula for this that you also want to have memorized, guys. You'll notice that here in the PowerPoint, the formula is CO, which stands for cardiac output. CO equals SV times HR. So the amount of blood multiplied by the number of beats, because that's how much blood per beat. Your NASM text will not write this formula this way. They're going to write it like this with a Q. Q stands for cardiac output because this is a quotient. So apologize for that. That's a weird thing that NASM does. So Q equals HR times SV. You may see that formula. They'll never make you do math on this stuff ever, but they will say like, what does this formula represent? And it represents cardiac output. All righty. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about like the conducting side of the heart. So let's talk a little bit about like your heart's rhythm and how it generates electricity. So again, just like any other cell inside of your body, your heart is relying on electrochemical signals, right? But the heart, we contract our skeletal muscle when our nervous system zaps our muscular system, causing it to contract. And the same thing is true within your heart. Your nervous system, a part of it at least, initiates contact, and then your heart sends an electric signal throughout all the cells to cause them all to contract, just like in your muscles, right? But what's cool about your heart is that your heart can produce its own electric signal because the channels inside of it, remember we talked about like sodium potassium pumps? And that's how we are generating this action potential, right? We look at a sodium potassium pump here, right? And it's moving sodium from one side to the other, potassium from one side to the other. That nature hates that, so it wants to move those back. And then the electrons, as they're moving, that's how electricity is created, right? Well, these pumps kind of actively do that in your muscles. You know, you are flushing stuff, you're burning up energy to do it. In your heart, it's a little bit different. In your heart, it actually leaks a little bit. So what you'll see is some of these pumps are very active in that they can like open up and stuff, versus other ones which are actually pretty passive and stuff just naturally flows back into the other position. So these leaky sodium potassium pumps allow your heart's contraction to basically set you up for your heart's next contraction. And that's what's so cool about your heart, you know, and it starts beating since before you were born and never stops ever again, you know, because it's constantly leaking and resetting its own electric signal. And so since that's happening, though, you know, since there is like this constant electric signal being generated, we need to make sure that like, you know, we have something controlling that signal. You know, we want to make sure the rhythm of that signal is always consistent. And so what we have is we have what is called your sinoatrial node. This is known as the pacemaker of the heart, and it has a bunch of what are called pacemaker cells. And so your heart's producing its own electric signal, but the pacemaker is regulating what pace that signal is going at. And it lives right here inside of your right atrium. So there's a couple different things they might ask you about the sinoatrial node that you want to have memorized. You want to memorize that it's the pacemaker of the heart. You want to have memorized that it lives inside of your right atrium. And you got to memorize that its job is to regulate the signal of your heart. Oh, and it's also autonomic. You don't have any control over your SA node. But the SA node, it lives right here. And what will happen is it regulates the signal. It says, okay, well, now it's time to create a contraction. So it sends that signal throughout some of the heart. And you'll notice that like there are these, you know, they kind of look like wires, right? And they go to the top of the heart first, which makes sense because when you look at your heartbeat, when you look at how your heart beats, you'll notice it goes from top to bottom, right? It kind of squeezes up here. Well, this started backwards, but you get it. You know, kind of, there we go. It goes from like top to bottom, kind of goes in this wave, right? And that's because like the SA node stimulates these muscle fibers first, and then the signal travels down to this little guy right here, which is called your AV node. That's your atrioventricular node. This delays the signal to all this bottom stuff. And that way this can contract first. Then once that signal is done being delayed, it'll branch out to what's called your bundle of His, which is the coolest freaking name ever. And then that branches out from there into what are called your Purkinje fibers. And that is traveling throughout the really muscular part of your heart, creating the contraction down there. But the sinoatrial node is the pacemaker. So this is where when you picture, like when you see it in a movie, or, you know, you guys are all going to have AED training. Everybody in here has to go get CPR certified. Part of getting CPR certified is getting AED certified as well, which stands for Automated External Defibrillator, which is basically the thing you see in movies where they're like, clear, except that you're not doing it manually. You're basically going to put these little patches on somebody, hook them up to a machine, and the machine will go clear, and it'll zap them. Little robot will do it for you, which is great. So when you get AED certified, what that defibrillator does is, you know, a lot of people think it's like, oh, it starts your heart back up because your heart stopped, right? What's funny is your heart didn't actually stop. It's actually trying to contract. The problem is it's out of rhythm. The electric signal got screwed up somehow. Maybe this person touched like a live power cable and it electrocuted them so hard that it screwed up the rhythm of their heart, or maybe some of the chambers didn't get any oxygen, so then they weren't able to, not chambers, but maybe some of the cells inside the heart weren't able to get enough oxygen, so then they didn't contract, which means that like the electric signal wasn't able to generate enough ATP because there wasn't oxygen. That's coronary heart disease, right? So something happened, and now your heart's out of rhythm, and so it is quivering. It's basically it's what we call fibrillating. I wonder if I can find a GIF of this. Fibrillation GIF. Can I see a picture of this? Hey, there we go. So see how this is kind of going in a wave, right? It's like boop, 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 and it's kind of going in a wave back and forth. But see, this one here is just kind of quivering all over the place. It looks random almost, right? That's fibrillation. So what you need to do, and this is what sounds kind of crazy, but you need to electrocute the heart using a defibrillator, and it zaps your heart with so much electricity that it basically blows out the signal. And that allows the sinoatrial node to restart the signal, and now everyone's listening to him again, you know? I had a weird analogy. I'm not going to use that one. Picture it as like if you're in a room, if you're in a room with people and you're trying to get everyone's attention, you're like, excuse me, you're like, hey, I have something to say. And then somebody else comes in, they're like, shut up. And then everyone's really quiet. And then you're like, yes, class announcement. And then you're able to kind of get everyone's attention. That's how defibrillators work. They basically they hit so much electricity through the heart that all of the signals get interrupted, which allows the SA node, the pacemaker, to restart the signal at the pace that it's supposed to go. And you guys are all going to learn how to do that when you go get your CPR certifications. Does anybody here already have one, by the way? Anybody ever had CPR before? Andres, I guess, yeah, you're in the massage side of things, so you've probably done it. But yeah, that's what you'll have to do. Okay. Moving on from there and looking at your, oh wait, actually. So your SA node, by the way, it is in charge of like setting the pace. And I would consider the SA node almost to be part of your nervous system, because I mean, it's not really part of your nervous, it's in your heart, but it is like, working intimately with your nervous system. So when your nervous system tells the SA node to start sending signals faster, that's what increases your heart rate. Or it could also be your endocrine system. Your hormones also might, your blood, if you have like a lot of adrenaline in your blood, right? Adrenaline runs past these little receptors in your heart, and your heart's like, oof, that is some adrenaline. We should go faster, right? And then that picks up your heart's rate. That's why, if you remember that scene from Pulp Fiction, that horrifying scene where Uma Thurman's having like a heart attack, and he takes a giant adrenaline needle and like sticks it into her heart, and she's like, that's because her heart stopped, shot it with a bunch of adrenaline, and that increased the heart rate. Don't do that. But all that is under the control of your either your autonomic nervous system or your endocrine system. So, the sympathetic fight or flight part of your nervous system will speed your heart up. The parasympathetic rest and digest part of your nervous system will slow your heart down. Epinephrine, which is that adrenaline we saw in Pulp Fiction, speeds your heart rate up, and so does stuff called thyroxine. And there's the parts of the brain that control these things. We don't need to have that memorized or anything. So obviously it's really important to make sure that you're keeping your heart healthy. And so there are medications out there that can do this. The biggest one, I love it, it's at the top of the list, lifestyle changes. If you have heart disease, change it up, do something new, figure out a way to create like a healthier lifestyle. And that's going to have really positive effects. But if you have to, there are medications out there. There's things like statins and anticoagulants. Sometimes like, the problem that people have with their heart is just the fact that their heart, their blood's too sticky, sounds kind of crazy, but basically they're just coagulated. So we need to make sure that heart can have an easier time pumping that blood. And that's why we have anticoagulants like warfarin, which is really intense, but even aspirin. Aspirin draws water into your blood, so it thins it out, makes it easier for your blood to pump it. This is why you see all those commercials when someone says like, someone's having a heart attack, go get them a Bayer, right? That's aspirin. It can save their life because like it makes it easier for their heart to pump that blood. Nitroglycerin can open up your blood vessels, beta blockers, antidiuretics, calcium channel blockers. All these are different types of medications that can slow down, speed up your heart rate, increase your blood pressure, decrease your blood pressure. There's lots of like heart surgeries out there as well. There's also pacemakers, which if your SA node becomes damaged and can't, control the rhythm of your heart effectively, we can install what's called a pacemaker. They'll put it under the skin or maybe sometimes outside the skin, but basically it's a little wire that will run into this little valve right here, and then it starts acting as the pacemaker instead. And when your SA node doesn't do what it's supposed to do, pacemaker will zap it. You've got coronary bypass. Sometimes if, these coronary arteries are not getting enough blood, a doctor will actually take a different blood vessel and they'll attach like a tube, which will, create like more blood flow to the heart tissues. Usually they use like, some other type of vessel. Or sometimes when your coronary arteries just become blocked with plaque, what they'll do is they'll do what's called an angioplasty. And they take this little balloon that's deflated, they thread it through your blood vessels, and then they inflate it, which basically pushes all the plaque away and kind of cleans it out. And then you can see all this empty space in there. What they'll do is they will thread in what's called a stent. And then they will put the stent in there, and then they'll reinflate that balloon. And then that basically creates like this framework that holds your blood vessel open. And that's what my mom had to have. My mom had to have a stent put in because she had a heart attack, Basically, she blocked her coronary arteries with like a lot of, plaque and cholesterol and things like that. And so they took a little balloon in there and, opened up her blood vessel, and now it can't close down. And that's your heart, guys. Any questions before we move on to blood vessels? Looking at veins and stuff.
So far, so good.
Cool. All right. So blood vessels, right? Let's take a look at like circulating blood. So again, today we're going to talk about blood vessels, the types and the circuits that you've got. And then honestly, we'll look a little bit about like blood flow and pressure and stuff. And then that's honestly about it. Like we're not going to really cover too much of like, systemic diseases or arterial diseases. We will, I guess we'll talk a little bit about like, certain vascular disorders, but other than that, we're really just going to talk about the anatomy here. So looking at your vascular system, it is, like I said earlier, a closed system of vessels that transport blood to and from the different tissues of the body. So that could be the heart, it could be the lungs, depends on where it's going, right? So when we look at this, remember earlier I said sort of like a big figure eight, right? Where blood is going from heart to lungs to heart to body to heart to lungs to heart to body, right? That's the system we're looking at here. And you can see it like traveling out there. This is kind of a interesting representation here. Some of it goes to your internal organs, some of it goes to your legs, some of it goes to your head and your arms, some of it goes to your lungs, right? And so we've got a lot of different like sections that our blood vessels are heading towards, and we've got different types of blood vessels, right? We've got arteries, which are blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart. Okay, and that is always what an artery is. An artery will always, we label our blood vessels based off the direction they're traveling. If blood is leaving going away from the heart, it is always going to be an artery. Okay, so looking here, right, we can see blood is leaving this ventricle away from the heart, right? That is an artery. And then right about here, where it reaches the halfway point, suddenly it starts traveling through a vein, and a vein is traveling back towards the heart. So when we can see like, this blood that's traveling away from the heart here, from this ventricle, right? This is going to pump blood towards the lungs. That is an artery, right? So this is a pulmonary artery, and this is a systemic artery, okay? So arteries are traveling away from the heart, okay? And then you're going to have arterioles, which are basically like small branches of arteries. You can see like here's an artery, and then it branches down and it looks just like a little smaller. That's an arteriole. There's really not a huge difference between arteries and arterioles. They both do kind of the same thing. It's just the arteries are the big ones and arterioles are the small ones. But arterioles will eventually branch smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until they start forming these little beds that cover our tissues. Okay, doesn't matter what type of tissue it is. If it's covered in these little blood vessels here, and those little blood vessels are going to be your capillaries. So capillaries are these little tiny microscopic blood vessels. A lot of times these capillaries are actually smaller than your blood cells, which sounds really confusing because you're like, how the hell is the tube smaller than the thing traveling through the tube? Well, that's why your blood cells can actually fold themselves while they're sort of like a little disc, because then they can fold and they can fit through these little tiny capillaries sometimes. So capillaries are very, 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 very small, and they are making the actual exchange sites that are covering your tissues. So they cover your tissues and they act where, like, oxygen is going to be dropped off, CO2 is going to be picked up, whatever, right? You've got capillaries covering your lungs, you've got capillaries covering your muscles, covering all the tissues throughout your entire body. But then those capillaries all start to come together and they start traveling back towards the heart, which means they're going to travel through a vein. But we've got small branches of veins first. Those are going to be called your venules, which eventually all come together and together, and eventually form like your actual veins. And then veins are going to, travel all the way back to the heart, and then they'll dump, all the blood back into the heart so that it can travel away. So arteries go away from the heart, veins go towards the heart. Capillaries act as like the beds that are the actual exchange sites for nutrients and other materials, right? So looking at that, one thing that's unique here, you might notice that like the artery here is much, much larger, right? Arteries are very, very big, which makes a lot of sense because they have to be. I mean, this is where pressure is really, really high. Your heart just squeezed, right? So the pressure in an artery is much, much higher than the pressure in a vein. The pressure in veins is actually relatively low, which because of that, veins have these special little valves inside of them that we don't see in arteries. You can see these little valves right here. And what that does is if I were to pump blood through this way and it traveled up, and then all of a sudden, like my heart relaxed for a second, which maybe would cause the blood to start backflowing, this vein is going to passively close down, and that's going to keep blood from backflowing, into my legs. But that doesn't always happen, right? Sometimes blood starts pooling in the legs and it starts to stretch your veins out. And that's what we call like a varicose vein. So when you see like varicose veins in people, right, you can see it's where basically blood was pooling in the legs, and that pooling in the legs caused, the veins to actually get stretched out and stuff. So that is what we see in our vein. These valves are supposed to prevent that from happening, but in a really weak heart, eventually it just pools and pools and pools. Looking at your different pulmonary circuits here, looking at your different circuits here, you've got your pulmonary circuit and you've got your systemic circuit, right? So the pulmonary circuit is like your pulmonary arteries and all the branches that's going to your lungs, right? So we think about like that circuit, you've got like arteries going towards your lungs and you got veins, coming away from your lungs, right? Because arteries are going away from the heart and veins are going back towards the heart. So if oxygen's going to the lungs, it's going to if blood's going to the lungs, it's going to pick up oxygen. And if blood's coming back from the lungs, it's going to deliver that oxygen. So you've got a lot of capillaries inside of your lungs. You have a lot of pulmonary veins, all these different areas that are absolutely covering your lung tissue in order to allow for oxygen to be able to exchange these nutrients. And then you've got the systemic circuit, right? And the systemic circuit is traveling to the rest of all your systems, your brain, your muscles, all of that, right? And so that's going to be your aorta, which is the really, really big one. And then it's going to split off into all of the different blood vessels that cover the tissues of your entire body. So when we're looking at your blood vessels, you'll see they have all these what we call little tunics, which are basically like little muscles, and that allows them to contract and expand. And so, you're going to have air, like when you need to create like high pressure in an area, you are probably going to keep your blood vessel relatively constricted, and then it might open up in a second. And what that does, that causes blood to rush to a certain area. This is how your nervous system is controlling your blood flow. You've probably experienced a very sudden and dramatic drop in blood pressure without even realizing it. If you've ever been sitting down for a while and then all of a sudden you're like, all right, and then you like jump up and then all of a sudden like the world disappears and you feel like you're going to pass out, you know? What that is like basically all this blood has been pooling in your legs and it wasn't really ready to do any intense physical activity. So you jumped up and all of a sudden all of the blood stayed in your legs and it wasn't able to deliver any blood to your brain because you created a really area of like high pressure up here and an area of low pressure down here. Blood wants to be in the area of low pressure. So blood pooled in your legs and all of a sudden you're like, whoo, because your brain didn't get any oxygen for a second. And your brain goes, all right, well, since you didn't give me, all right, lay down. And it'll be a lot easier for blood to flow if you're horizontal. So you start to pass out, right? You know, that is how your body kind of controls, because you only have so much blood. So when you are in fight or flight mode, like when you're exercising, for instance, your body is going to open up the blood vessels that travel to all of your skeletal muscle so that blood travels there and delivers oxygen to your legs and your arms and your muscles and, you know, things like that. But your digestive system, the blood flow is going to constrict because we actually don't really want blood to go to the digestive system. We've only got so much blood. So that's what's happening during fight or flight responses. But during rest and digest responses, the exact opposite is true. Your body will then instead, constrict the blood vessels going to your skeletal muscle, and it will expand the blood vessels going to your digestive system. So that is what we're going to see there in terms of oxygen delivery and stuff and how our blood vessels actually work. And you can see, you know, look at how much thicker the walls here in an artery are. The pressure is much, much, much higher, right? Whereas the walls in a vein, the pressure is lower. We are not quite as worried about, like, you know, breaking that blood vessel if there's a lot of pressure here. So your capillaries, which are going to be the, you know, little microscopic blood vessels we're seeing, right? Those are going to have really, 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 really thin walls. And because the walls of capillaries are so thin, that's why we get bruising sometimes. You know, when you hit yourself, which, you know, might break some of the walls of those blood vessels, the blood starts to leak out and starts to pool under your skin, and we see like a bruise. So the largest artery that you've got, like I said, it's going to be that aorta. You know, it's getting blood directly being shot out of the heart where pressure is the highest. So your aorta is huge. It's about the size of like a garden hose. And then that's going to branch off into, you know, smaller and smaller sections, smaller arteries like your, you know, abdominal artery, your thoracic artery, your femoral artery, right? Brachial artery. And so it'll branch down into all those smaller pieces. And then that's going to branch out, you know, smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until it becomes like an arteriole. And then those arterioles will branch into capillaries. Then you've got, and there's all the different arteries running throughout your body. Here's your, you know, carotid artery. This is the one that, you know, we often test our pulse with, but we also sometimes use our brachial artery, which is on the hand. You know, that's the one we're a little more familiar with. But you can see, again, they just branch out smaller and smaller and smaller. Then you've got all your veins, which do exactly the opposite, right? And they're going to travel back towards the body. So, you know, you'll have the capillaries will start to come together, then it'll have like a venule, and then they'll come together, and then you'll have like an overall vein. And then eventually you'll have that vein drop into your superior vena cava here, or maybe it'll drop into your inferior vena cava here. And it'll drop all that blood into that right atrium. And then there's also a lot of veins and a lot of arteries running through your digestive system. No surprise there, right? Especially when it comes to your liver. Your liver is actually where like a lot of stuff is, you know, first entering. When a red blood cell is born into this world from like a bone or something, it's got to go to your liver first. And then eventually it gets, you know, sucked into the heart. So when we're looking at this, right, and we're talking about like how we actually exchange oxygen and all these nutrients, we're looking at like an exchange happening in the capillary beds, right? So we call that capillary exchange or nutrient exchange. And it's describing how substances like oxygen and other nutrients, like sugars and stuff, are exchanged between cells. And so it does this mostly through diffusion. Remember diffusion? We talked about this when we were talking about fluids, right? It's how nutrients move. It's how like stuff moves from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So if you have a lot of oxygen on one side of a cell, right? So these red blood cells here have like a lot of oxygen in them. These red blood cells don't, right? And let's say this tissue over here needs oxygen. Well, the oxygen is actually going to move out of these red blood cells into the tissue. And now that red blood cell's got space for carbon dioxide. And there's very little carbon dioxide in the cell. So guess what? Carbon dioxide is going to move into that cell. And then it's going to, we're going to draw it on blue color now. And it'll travel wherever it needs to go, right? So when we're looking at that, right, that's how we are exchanging this oxygen, right? We've got blood pressure, which is allowing it to happen. So the actual pressure of your blood is creating, this movement of oxygen. But sometimes there's also like osmotic pressure, which is basically just meaning that, there's a concentration gradient. So there's pressure gradients and concentration gradients. Pressure gradients push the oxygen. Concentration gradients, I guess, kind of just passively move it. All of this, when we look at like blood flow and how it's controlled, is under the control of your nervous system, right? And so your nervous system is basically going to say, all right, we'll expand these blood vessels and constrict these ones. Again, kind of going back to the idea of like fight or flight. Now, here's the thing. Your heart's got to be able to suck blood all the way back, into itself. Blood could be really far away, and you might be standing up for a while. So luckily, one of the cool things about veins is they are situated near your skeletal muscle fibers. And when your skeletal muscle contracts, it actually pushes that blood back towards the heart. And so you can see like it's got these special valves in there, but also like the contraction of your muscles sends that blood back to the heart as well. So if you guys have ever seen someone who has locked their knees out, they always say, let's see here. Don't look. When you see this happen here, all these guys are standing at attention here. I don't know who it's going to be. Nope. Oh, it's a 4-minute video? No, internet. Not watching a 4-minute video. Our attention spans are real short nowadays, or at least mine is. All right, here we go.
Report, which followed a few minutes later, was destined to become internet lore.
You guys are teaching me how to cross country skis, so give us some base.
Brooke is fine, and the video was posted to YouTube, where it has been seen close to 5 million times.
That poor girl.
Fall on the skis.
2 News reporter Brooke Graham unknowingly foreshadowing during this live promotion last Saturday. Her live report, which followed a few minutes later, was destined to become internet lore.
You guys are teaching me how to cross country skis, so give us some base.
Oh boy.
Brooke is fine.
So
and the video
anyway,
was
that is why you do not lock your knees. It's not because it pinches the blood vessels closed, which is what a lot of people often will say. It's not pinching the blood vessels closed, but what it is doing is it's just not squeezing the blood vessels to send the blood back to the heart. So your brain is like, hey, I need some oxygen up here. We're going to make you lay down. And so, now it's very easy for blood to flow back and forth. Looking at like a regular heart rhythm here, before we kind of finish things up with blood pressure here, looking at like a normal heart rhythm and how it's tied to like how our blood vessels work, you are going to have like ventricular contraction, right? Your heart is going to squeeze the ventricles, and that's going to eject blood out of the heart. And so that blood is either going to travel to the lungs or it's going to travel out through the body, right? And then eventually, that is going to travel back to wherever it's going. And your pulse, right, which is what we're talking about when your heart is squeezing, it's influenced by like a lot of different things. Your body size, a little bit of it, your gender. Men tend to have a slightly different resting heart rate than women do, a little bit lower there. Your age, as you get older, your heart isn't quite as strong as it used to be. So it'll sort of pick up its heart rhythm a little bit, or maybe it'll slow it down, because the heart will actually get larger. Emotion can control it, right? Body temperature will control it. Your thyroid will control it. So there's a lot of different things that can control, your heart's rhythm and your blood pressures and things like that. And this is one of the reasons why like exercise has such positive effects on blood pressure. So talking about blood pressure, kind of pivoting into that, right? What that is it's the amount of force being exerted by your blood on your blood vessels. So when your heart squeezes, that pushes against your blood vessels. And when your heart relaxes, then it's not pushing as hard against the walls, right? So it's constantly pushing and relaxing on your blood vessels, kind of similar to the heart itself, right? And so your blood pressure is going to be determined a little bit by your cardiac output. If your blood pressure is really, really high, then your heart can't squeeze very much blood every time. So then your stroke volume is going to be really, really low, which means your heart has to beat more often. And the other thing that's going to determine it is the resistance to that blood flow. So if you're dehydrated and your blood is thicker because there's just not as much water flowing through it, that is going to raise your blood pressure. So normal blood pressure, what we're looking for, should be 120 millimeters of mercury over 80 millimeters of mercury. So 120 units of pressure over 80 units of pressure. And that is what we are measuring in your aorta right as it comes out of your heart. And that's what we want your pressure to be. The top number, which is the 120, is your systolic blood pressure, right? That is what's happening during systole. So when your heart contracts, which is systole, versus when your heart relaxes, which is diastole, your systolic blood pressure is the amount of pressure on your blood vessels when there is a lot of high pressure. This is why we want it to be 120. If it's all the way up over to 140, we consider that hypertension. And that's where it's like you have high blood pressure, which is not super great for your heart. That can damage your blood vessels. It means that your stroke volume is lower. It means that your heart's not performing as well as it should be. Your diastolic pressure is the amount during the relaxation. Healthy diastolic pressure is about 120 over, is about 80 units of pressure. So, during cardiac output again, right? The volume of blood pumped out of your heart each minute. That's what cardiac output is. It's your heart rate, the number of beats per minute, times your stroke volume, which is the amount of blood pumped per beat. If your blood pressure is really high, you can't get very much blood out of the heart, so your stroke volume is going to be relatively low. So there's a lot of different things that can mess with your blood pressure, right? It can be like different receptors running throughout your body that are causing it to contract and relax. Sometimes it's your total blood volume. If you are, again, dehydrated, your blood volume is going to be kind of low. And that means that your heart's really sticky. Your blood's really sticky. And it's just not very easy to it's thick, right? It's like a sludge, So we want to make sure that like we are regularly hydrating in order to make sure that like our blood pressure stays normal. And we measure all this using one of the best words in the world, the sphygmomanometer. That's a blood pressure cuff. I just like saying that. So again, 120 over 80. If your blood pressure gets as high as like 140 over 90, that is what we consider hypertension. And that is, where it starts to get dangerous. That can start causing, damage to your heart. It can obviously mean the tissues aren't getting enough oxygen delivery, and it's a sign of coronary heart disease. So that is actually about all the big stuff. I'm going to mention just a couple diseases here at the end, but I'm going to move through them pretty quick. We are going to talk much more about this in our special populations class next mod. So there are different vascular disorders out there, like hemorrhaging, which is where like a blood vessel will actually start to leak, which is really dangerous because, if that happens in like your brain, for instance, your blood's leaking, right? It's not getting where it needs to go. That means that like oxygen's not getting delivered, which means cells are going to suffocate. There's also things like arteriosclerosis, which is basically like a hardening of the I'm sorry, a thinning of the walls inside of your blood vessels. So your blood vessels just get a lot thinner, which means if your pressure is really high while the walls are really thin, those walls could burst. There's also things like shock or thrombosis or varicose veins. We talked about varicose veins earlier. You can see atherosclerosis, which is like basically a hardening of your arteries because they are getting filled with plaque, which is a very hard material, you know. And so you can see like this is a normal artery here, and then we start to get like cholesterol and fatty buildup, which your immune system like further hardens because it's not really supposed to be there. And then all of a sudden, like this is, you know, look at how much, you know, there's just not as much blood that can travel through that type of artery. We start to see like aneurysms, which is like a bulging, and if that bursts, you know, it's going to lead to hemorrhaging. And then we see varicose veins here, right, where those veins get stretched out. And that is about all I have got for you tonight, guys. Not bad today. Any questions or comments? Anything you guys are worried about?
I'm pretty good, bro.
Love it. Well, if you guys haven't had a chance to do that midterm, please get that done as soon as you can. Study up because we got homework number 3 coming up tomorrow. But you got a day of rest from homework and stuff, and then you'll have the weekend. So, you know, study up and knock it out. But if you haven't got anything else from me, I'm going to let you guys go, and I'll see you all tomorrow.